Sunday was Easter. We just celebrated a great Easter. All of us did. I thought, it'd be interesting maybe to look at something that Jesus did after the resurrection. That's called post-resurrection experiences. In fact, in the Bible, we read about 13 what is called post-resurrection experiences. In other words, the Bible records 13 times that Jesus interacted with people and did things after he came out of the tomb. Now let me remind you, he may have done 100 things. Everything Jesus did is not in the Bible. You say, well, where's that verse? All right, now you can remember it. It's the very last verse in the Gospel of John. The last verse in the Gospel of John tells us that if everything Jesus did had been recorded in books, the world couldn't even contain the books. So just because we read these things, this is not all Jesus did. But in the Bible, we have these 13 things, and one of them is, and the fact it's the very first thing he did, he appeared to Mary Magdalene. Now look on page 972. I want to show you one little verse, then we're going to go read some scripture. But on page 972, you'll be in the Gospel of Mark, and I will be finally, if I get there, Mark chapter 16. Look with me down in verse number 9. Mark 16, verse 9. It says, now when Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, now watch this, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons. Now I wanted us to see that verse because it says 2 or 3 things that we're going to talk about in a little bit when we kind of get into this thing. So the very first thing that Jesus did, the very first person that saw Jesus after he came out of that tomb was Mary Magdalene. Now, if you turn over to page 961, you'll be in the Gospel of John. And I want us to go over to John chapter number 20, and let's kind of read this story over here after having read that. In John chapter number 20, verse number 1 says, now the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Then she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved. Now that would be the Apostle John. You remember in this book, John never identifies himself. He just refers to like the disciple that Jesus loved or the other disciple. But when we read this, verse 2, she ran and came to Simon Peter and the other disciple whom Jesus loved and said to them, they have taken away the Lord out of the tomb. We do not know where they have laid him. Peter therefore went out and the other disciples. See, John doesn't identify himself. People are saying, well, John was just so humble he didn't want to mention his name. Well, we'll read on. They were going to the tomb. So they both ran together. So you got Peter and John running together. And the other disciple, this is interesting, outran Peter. Well, I'd say he's not too humble. He said, I beat Peter to the tomb. But anyway, and came to the tomb first. So John's beat him. And he, that is John, stooping down. Now watch this. He looked in the tomb and saw the linen clothes lying there, yet he did not go in. Then Simon Peter, he finally got there, following him, went into the tomb. John just looked in the tomb. Peter goes into the tomb, and he saw the linen clothes lying there, and the handkerchief, or the face cloth, is what that's talking about, that had been around his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but folded together in a place by itself. Now that's a good sermon. I don't have time to get off on that sermon, but that little folded together handkerchief there there's a great lesson there. But anyway, verse 8. Then the other disciple, and that's John, who came to the tomb first, he's back letting you know he won the race again, went in also, and he saw and believed, for as yet they did not know the scriptures that he must rise again from the dead. Then the disciples went away again to their own homes. So Peter and John just go back home. I mean, that's always fascinated me, that verse. But look in verse 11. Mary Magdalene, she didn't go home. Mary Magdalene stood outside the tomb weeping. And as she wept, she stooped down and she looked into the tomb. And what did she see? She saw two angels in white sitting, one at the head, the other at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. Then they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they've laid him." Now, when she had said this, she turned around, saw Jesus standing there, and did not know that it was Jesus. Now, that's an interesting thing. She sees Jesus, but she doesn't recognize Jesus. And, I was doing some reading on that, all these different reasons she didn't recognize Jesus. Some of it's just, these commentaries, they can come up with some stuff. Obviously his resurrected body was different. But be that as it may, verse 15, Jesus said to her, now here's what Jesus says to her: "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" She, supposing him to be the gardener, said to him, "Sir, if you've carried Jesus away, tell me where you've laid him, and I'll take him away." Jesus said to her, now listen, he called her by her name. He said, "Mary." She turned and said to him, "Rabboni," which is teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father." Actually, I was thinking about this morning, she would be the first to know about the ascension. Jesus has just told her about the ascension. He said, "I've not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and go to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene came and told the disciples that she had seen the Lord and that he had spoken these things to her. Now, if we had one of the more modern translations, it does say, she goes back to the disciples, says, "I've seen the Lord." And we'll come back to that in just a moment. Well, that is that story. As I read that and just kind of think about Mary Magdalene, I thought about this. Changes in life can make a perspective adjustment needed. Now, the word perspective just means how you see things. We all have a perspective. I was listening on the radio this morning, coming in. People were phoning in to this program I was listening to with their perspective about what President Trump says he's going to do tonight over in Iran. It was very interesting what people were saying. And, each one, they were just sharing how they saw that. You have a perspective on that. I have a perspective. We all have a perspective on things, how we see things. Now, the fact of the matter is, when you have changes in life, many times your perspective needs to change. How you see things, like on the front end, as you go along, you say, I need to adjust how I see these things. I need to adjust my perspective. Now, Mary Magdalene is a good example of that. I just read to you back over in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus had cast these 7 demons out of her. And, I think every scholar you read about that would say, these demons would cause her to go into just seizures and just be in awful shape. Well, Jesus had cast all of that out of her. And from the moment Jesus did that, her perspective on things really did have a tremendous change and a tremendous adjustment. Now Magdala, the reason she's called Mary Magdalene, she's from I just call it a community called Magdala, which is about 3 miles from Capernaum. Many of you have been to the Holy Land. Nobody would go to the Holy Land, not go to Capernaum. And that was kind of the headquarters Jesus had in his ministry. Well, Magdala is just an area very close by that, 3 miles away. It was a real wealthy community. You say, well, how was it wealthy? Well, first of all, in the fishing business. That was a huge thing in that part of the country, right there on the Sea of Galilee, but not only in the fishing business, in the dye works. They had the minerals and all that was in the ground there, a lot of dye works. And then what you and I would call primitive, let's underline the word primitive, textile factories. They wouldn't have called them factories back in that day, but so this was a kind of a booming place where the right people owning the right stuff hooked into the right people could be very affluent people. And of course, one of the things we read about Mary Magdalene was that she and the other women, they supported Jesus in his work. So she was a person that was not without means. She had means, and yet she used those to help Jesus in his work. Now, her life seasons changed. When Jesus cast out those 7 demons, everything about Mary Magdalene, her whole life was just loving Jesus, following Jesus, supporting Jesus, being with Jesus right unto the very, very end. Even in the Garden of Gethsemane, all the disciples fled. You remember it. Peter followed Jesus at a distance as they took him from the garden over to Caiaphas' house. Man, the other disciples, they hightailed it out of there. Well, Mary Magdalene never did forsake Jesus. She never did run from Jesus. But now, as she had her different seasons in life, we all go through seasons in life. And as we do, the way we see things changes. As you get older, age would be a good example. I'm not old, but some of you are old. And as you get older, and as I get older, I see things differently. Would we not all agree on that? Long years ago, I was midlife, I guess, at that point. A thought came to me one time, my daddy was a lot smarter than I ever thought he was. Most of us, when we were kids, we thought our parents, were not too sharp. Well, we get older and become parents ourselves, and we just, our parents were a little bit sharper than we thought we were. Well, Mary Magdalene, she had things change, and her perspective changed. In the aging process, that's a season of life, and sometimes our perspective changes for the good, way we see things. Other times it's not good, changes the other way. I think of in Luke 17, you had those 10 lepers Jesus healed, you remember? And you know the story. 9 never even came back and said thank you. 1 came back. Jesus said, where are the other 9? There were 10 of you guys. Where are the other 9? Well, why did the other 9 not come back? Well, they just saw things differently. Their perspective, it was not the right way. They needed to have a perspective adjustment, and they didn't have that. And so that is a very true statement that changes in life can make our perspective change. Not only that, disappointments in life can make a perspective adjustment very much needed. Now, when Jesus was on the cross, Mary Magdalene, this is very interesting to me, the Bible says they were from afar, from a distance, but they watched Jesus be crucified. They watched Jesus be crucified. And the disciples had fled, but not these women. They stayed. And in the seasons of life, and that was another season of life from her, Jesus, who she loved, was being crucified. So she would have had great disappointment. And in the seasons of life, disappointment comes. We all have disappointments in life. And interesting, what did she do? Well, her adjustment was she traded her tears for excitement. And you see that down in that last verse that we read a moment ago. Look in verse 18. It says, Mary Magdalene came and told the disciples, literally what she said, I've seen the Lord. Now, in my earlier reading of those verses in chapter 20, 2 or 3 times it mentions she was weeping. So she's traded her tears into excitement. You read that. You can read that verse 18 like Mary Magdalene came and told the disciples, "I've seen the Lord." I don't think her tone would have been like that. Can you imagine the excitement that she would have had when she came to tell the disciples, "Hey guys, you're not going to believe this. I've seen the Lord." Well, she just was excited about. She had really made a real perspective adjustment in a fantastic and in a wonderful thing. How we see things determines what we say and what we do. I had the most interesting thing Sunday in that 11 o'clock service during the music part. I thought, well, I'm going to mill around here and speak to some folks, not disturb the service, but you just say, hey, thank you for being here and hope you have a great Easter. And now I'm smart enough to know when you get in a room the size of that room and the preacher starts roaming around, you're going to bump into somebody out there you wish you had not bumped into. Do you understand that? Well, everybody was just, and it was just like heaven coming down, and the music was just fantastic, and people were just being so nice. And I was speaking to people that I don't know. I was speaking to some people I didn't even know the people, but I want to know the people. But I was wanting to say, hey, I hope you have a great Easter, and thank you for being here. Well, as I was coming back down the front, we have some spots back in that front section for people that are in wheelchairs, where we have special place where the wheelchairs will fit. But like in about a row or two in front of that, everybody was standing up singing, but there was this lady that she wasn't standing up, which is okay. I mean, sometimes I don't always stand up for every song, but anyway, I just kind of tapped her on the shoulder and I said, ma'am, hope you have a great Easter and thank you for being here. And she looked at me and she said, this isn't holy. I thought, well, I don't hear the best in the world. I must have missed that. I said, what's that again? I'm sorry, what did you say? She said, this whole thing's not holy. I said, well, I'm sorry you feel that way, but I do hope you have a good Easter. And that's what I said. I was so proud of what I said. I wanted to suggest a couple of other churches she might go to where maybe she'd find them to be more holy. Well, anyway, now that lady she may be going through the worst thing in life. I don't know why. I don't know how anybody could be that spirit on Easter in church, but you never know what's in a person's heart. I mean, maybe she just had a death in the family. I don't know. But maybe it was good I bumped into her. I think she was just glad to let me know what she felt. And she did, and I got it. Now I'm sharing it with you. But anyway, be that as it may, I think she needed perspective adjustment. That'd be my observation. Now, having said that, as I thought about old Mary Magdalene, thought about changes in life, disappointments in life, they do change our perspective on things. Now, Dottie not getting well is the biggest disappointment I've ever had in my life. I mean, we lived with that for 10 months. And in those 10 months, probably 8 of those months, we really thought and hoped that we would get well. And that didn't work out. And that's disappointing. Many of you, we've all had disappointments. I just say, though, my list of disappointments in life, that heads the list. Now, her death is the biggest change that I've ever been through in my life. No question about that. Many of you have been there. I had an email this morning from a member whose wife went to be with the Lord some years ago, and he made an interesting statement. He said, the fact is, Pastor, he says, I've been through what you're going through, but the deal is nobody understands what you're going through. Nobody fully understands what you're going through. They want to understand. They try to understand. They think they understand. And it's the same with you. You go through things, and we all try to understand. But, we don't all understand everything about that. But here's the bottom line. Kind of where I am in this thing now, like people, I got some of this Sunday, and it's very sincere, good question. They'll say, well, Pastor, they'll ask me this question. They'll say, how you doing? Well, that's a fair question. I mean, they know I don't have an answer, actually, but they do care. But, I think kind of where I am in that deal, and it really fits in this about changes and disappointments. Like, the fact is, I'm in what's called the process of grief. And many of you have been there. And grief has its stages. And I'm somewhere in all that, which is like where I am. Now, someone says, well, how are you doing? Well, I think, In fact, I like this so much, I've even written it down on a card, have it in my pocket, but I wrote it down here too. The truth is, where am I in this process? I'm learning to trust God in deeper ways. That's where I kind of am. I'm learning to trust God in deeper ways. And like where I am in my disappointment, my change, my happiness for her is helping me with my own sadness. I just think about how she is, and like it changes your perspective. Like the wrong perspective would be, and I see people do this with death and with other things. People can have disappointments come in life that can make them very bitter. I can think of one man just came to my mind now that I tried one time years back. To my knowledge, he's never even been to this church, but I knew him in other ways, and I tried to talk to him about God one day, and he said to me, "You don't know my history. I have a child that died, and I hate God, and I would never go to a church." Well, I think a child dying would be the hardest. I think that would be harder than your mate dying. I pray I never know. But I say that to say this, breaks my heart about that, but his perspective went the wrong way. I want to encourage you, when bad things happen, don't go to blaming God. One day it'll all make sense and we'll see it better. But I think that things can just happen. It can be something. You could go to a restaurant and have a bad waiter and just say, "Food in this place is horrible." Well, the food wasn't horrible. The waiter was no good. Or you can have kind of mediocre food with a good waiter and think the thing was better than it was. I mean, how we see things is very, very important. I just want to encourage you today, as you journey through life and you have changes and disappointments, just ask God to help you. If you need a perspective adjustment, say, "God, show me where I need a perspective adjustment, and help me to make that adjustment in such a way that I'd be the better and I'd be a blessing to others." And so, Father, that's kind of what I see in Mary Magdalene. After Jesus cast out those 7 demons, she loved Jesus with all of her heart, all of her soul, all of her mind. She owed him much, she gave much, she loved much, and she served much. Her perspective changed. And God, help us in the midst of change and disappointments in our life. Help us always kind of pay attention to how we see things and help us adjust what needs adjusting, is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.